Most people are not failing their budgets because they lack information. They are failing because they have never been taught that money carries a weight. Not currency weight or mathematical weight, but spiritual weight. It demands attention. It requires decisions. And every dollar you ignore becomes a decision you forfeit to circumstance, emotion, or pressure. The Bible does not treat money as neutral. It treats it as a test. Scripture ties your handling of provision directly to your fitness for greater responsibility. Luke 16:10 makes this clear. Whoever is faithful with little will be faithful with much. That is not metaphorical. That is covenantal. You are being watched, not by creditors or algorithms, but by the one who owns everything you think you possess. Budgeting is not about spreadsheets or restriction. It is about stewardship under authority. Genesis 1:28 gave humanity dominion over creation, but dominion is not autonomy. You manage what God owns. Romans 14:12 says each of us will give account to God. That includes the $400 overdraft you justified, the subscription you forgot, the impulse buy you rationalized as self-care. All of it falls under the same standard Joseph used when he stood before Pharaoh. How will this decision serve the people entrusted to me when the famine comes? This is for education and spiritual reflection, not financial advice. What follows are 8 scripture-based steps built on the same principles that governed ancient grain storage, temple economics, and early church giving. These are not hacks. They are not motivational frameworks. They are accountability structures pulled from passages that treat money as a stewardship issue, not a lifestyle issue. If you have been treating your budget like a suggestion, you may find these steps uncomfortable. That discomfort is the starting point. Know your true financial condition. Proverbs 27:23. You cannot manage what you refuse to count. That instinct to avoid checking your balance, to let bills pile up unopened, to keep spending vague so you never have to face a number. That is not spontaneity. That is willful blindness. And Proverbs 27:23 calls it out directly. Be sure to know the state of your flocks. Give careful attention to your herds. This is not advice. It is a command rooted in covenantal responsibility. In ancient Israel, flocks were survival. A shepherd who failed to track the health, number, or condition of his animals would wake up to theft, disease, or starvation without warning. Proverbs 27:24 follows immediately. Riches are not forever, nor does a crown endure to every generation. Wealth vanishes when it is not watched. Authority collapses when stewardship is neglected. The text is not describing bad luck. It is describing consequences. Joseph demonstrated this principle in Genesis 41 by surveying every district of Egypt before famine arrived. He knew exactly what he had, where it was stored, and how long it would last. That precision saved nations. Today, people treat ignorance as protection. They assume if they do not check their account, the overdraft does not count. If they do not open the credit card statement, the interest is not real. If they avoid tracking their spending, they can claim they don't know where it all goes without guilt. But Luke 16:10 says God evaluates your fitness for larger assignments based on how you handle small amounts. Ignoring your financial condition does not make you free. It disqualifies you. This principle extends beyond personal finance. Pastors, employers, parents, anyone entrusted with oversight must know the state of those under their care. Acts 20:28 applies the same language to spiritual leadership. Keep watch over the flock. Proverbs 12:10 says a righteous person regards even the life of his animal. If God holds you accountable for livestock, how much more for the household he placed in your hands? Start by writing down 3 numbers. Total income this month, total spent, total owed. Repeat weekly. The discomfort you feel is not failure. It is the beginning of stewardship. Count the cost before you commit. Luke 14:28. Jesus used a half-built tower to describe a failed disciple. The image is brutal because it was common. In first-century Judea, unfinished construction projects stood as public monuments to bad planning. Everyone who passed would mock the builder. This man began to build and was not able to finish. Luke 14:30 records. Jesus was not talking about carpentry. He was talking about commitment that crumbles under the weight of its own promises. The principle applies to every financial decision that demands follow-through. Luke 14:28 asks directly, "Which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it?" This is not pessimism, it is wisdom. The Greek word for count here carries the sense of calculation, of sitting down with numbers and making an honest assessment before proceeding. It is the same word used in Revelation 13:18 to calculate the number of the beast. Precision matters. Guesswork leads to collapse. Modern financial culture inverts this. It pressures you to say yes first and figure out payment later. Sign the lease, then scramble for rent. Enroll in the program, then panic about tuition. Book the trip, then go into debt. The assumption is that desire justifies commitment, and commitment will somehow generate resources. But Proverbs 21:5 contrasts planning with haste. The plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. Rushing into obligation without counting capacity does not demonstrate faith. It demonstrates foolishness. Jesus followed the tower illustration with a second parable about a king going to war. The king who does not assess his own strength before engaging the enemy will send a delegation to negotiate peace while the opposing army is still far off. Luke 14:31-32 explains. Surrender born from miscalculation is humiliating. But the deeper issue is verse 33. Any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Jesus was teaching that true discipleship requires full inventory. You cannot follow him halfway. You must count the cost of total surrender, then commit only if you are willing to finish. Apply the same standard to your budget. Before you obligate future income, ask, can I complete this, or am I building a monument to my own poor judgment? Make a diligent plan and stick to it. Proverbs 21:5. Diligence is not the same as effort. You can work hard and still drift into poverty if your labor has no structure. Proverbs 21:5 draws a sharp line. The plans of the diligent lead to profit as surely as haste leads to poverty. The contrast is not between working and resting. It is between planning and reacting. One leads to abundance, the other leads to loss, regardless of how much sweat you produce. The Hebrew word for diligent in this verse implies persistence, intentionality, and foresight. It is the same quality Joseph displayed when he built grain storage infrastructure across Egypt before the famine arrived. He did not wait for hunger to force a plan. He created the plan during abundance so it could function during scarcity. Proverbs 6:6-8 points to the ant as another model. It stores its provisions in summer and gathers its food at harvest without being commanded. Diligence is proactive. It operates on rhythm, not crisis. Haste, by contrast, appears productive, but produces nothing sustainable. People mistake motion for progress. They chase opportunities without evaluating cost. They switch strategies midstream because another option looks easier. Proverbs 21:5 says this pattern surely leads to poverty. Not occasionally, not probably, surely. The one who acts too quickly or in a hurry ends up in scarcity no matter how many hours they log. The issue is not laziness, it is lack of coherent direction. Modern budgeting often fails here. People create elaborate plans in January, then abandon them by March when motivation fades or an unexpected expense disrupts the system. But biblical planning is not about perfection, it is about persistence. Proverbs 10:4 notes that diligent hands bring wealth. Hands, not spreadsheets. The plan is a tool, not a trophy. Adjust it when circumstances shift, but do not discard it because it feels restrictive. Write down your income. Assign every dollar a purpose before the month begins. Review weekly, adjust as needed, and repeat next month. That rhythm, sustained over time, is what Proverbs calls diligence. If you have tried budgeting before and quit, drop what broke the system in the comments. Practice Joseph-style crisis budgeting and store in plenty. Genesis 41:47-49. Joseph did not invent grain storage. What he invented was systemic preparation for a crisis no one else believed was coming. Genesis 41:47-49 describes 7 years of abundance in Egypt, during which Joseph collected all the excess food and stored it in cities throughout the land. Verse 49 says, "The grain became like the sand of the sea," until they stopped measuring it because there was too much. That sentence should disturb you. Most people cannot imagine having so much margin they stop counting. Joseph's strategy was decentralized and local. He did not build one massive warehouse in the capital. He stored grain in each city, the food grown in the fields surrounding it. This minimized transportation loss and ensured accessibility when famine struck. It was brilliant logistics, but it was also biblical stewardship. Proverbs 21:20 says, "Precious treasure and oil are in a wise man's dwelling, but a foolish man consumes them." Joseph preserved during plenty. He refused to let abundance justify waste. Modern financial behavior inverts this. When income rises, spending rises faster. When bonuses arrive, they vanish into purchases that were deserved or overdue. The assumption is that abundance is for consumption, not storage. But Genesis 41:53-56 records what happened next. 7 years of famine arrived exactly as predicted, and Joseph opened all the storehouses. Egypt survived. Surrounding nations came to buy grain. Joseph's decision to store during surplus became the mechanism that saved not just one household, but entire populations. This is not about hoarding. It is about stewardship that thinks beyond the current season. Luke 14:28 asks if you count the cost before building. Joseph counted the cost of famine before it arrived. He worked diligently during the 7 years of plenty, surveying land, hiring staff, constructing storage, and gathering surplus. When crisis came, the infrastructure was already in place. Start by setting aside 10% of every paycheck into a separate account labeled Famine Fund. Do not touch it unless true crisis arrives. Let it grow like sand by the sea until you stop counting. Build a buffer for lean seasons. Genesis 41:53-56. The famine arrived exactly when Joseph said it would. Genesis 41:53-54 records the transition with brutal simplicity. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was no grace period, no warning announcement. The surplus stopped, and scarcity began. Every nation felt it. But Egypt had food because Joseph had built margin into the system before crisis forced his hand. Verse 55 describes the moment of public panic. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Pharaoh's response reveals who held real authority in that moment. He did not attempt to solve the crisis himself. He pointed the entire nation to Joseph. Go to Joseph and do what he tells you. Joseph's preparation gave him the authority to serve at scale. His buffer became the nation's lifeline. Genesis 41:56 says Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. He did not give it away. He sold it. This was not charity. It was stewardship that preserved both supply and dignity. He managed distribution carefully, ensuring grain reached cities across the region without waste or favoritism. Verse 57 expands the scope. All the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. His 7-year buffer saved not just one household, but surrounding nations. Most people today live paycheck to paycheck, with no margin for disruption. One missed shift, one medical bill, one car breakdown triggers a cascade of debt and panic. Proverbs 21:20 contrasts two households. Precious treasure and oil are in a wise man's dwelling, but a foolish man consumes them. The fool spends everything during abundance. The wise person builds a buffer. Start by saving 1 month of essential expenses, then 3, then 6. Let the storehouses fill slowly, knowing that famine does not announce itself in advance. Which lean season caught you unprepared? Drop it in the comments. Pursue contentment with needs met first. Timothy 6:8. Paul did not define contentment as having enough to be comfortable. He defined it as having enough to survive. 1 Timothy 6:8 sets the threshold shockingly low. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Not savings, not security, not even shelter explicitly mentioned. Food and clothing, that is the biblical floor for contentment. Everything above that line is abundance, not necessity. The context makes this even more uncomfortable. 1 Timothy 6:6-7 establishes the foundation. Godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. You enter life empty-handed. You exit the same way. Everything in between is temporary stewardship, not permanent possession. Verse 9 follows with a warning about those who want to get rich, falling into temptation and a trap. The issue is not wealth itself. It is the refusal to be content without it. Modern culture treats contentment as settling. Advertisements are designed to manufacture dissatisfaction, so you will spend to fill the gap. You are told your phone is obsolete, your wardrobe is outdated, your car is embarrassing, your home is inadequate. The message is relentless. You do not have enough, and you will not be enough until you acquire more. But Hebrews 13:5 directly confronts this. Keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have. For God has said, "Never will I leave you, never will I forsake you." Contentment is not rooted in abundance. It is rooted in God's presence. This principle does not forbid planning or provision. Proverbs 21:5 still applies. Joseph still stored grain, but 1 Timothy 6:8 redefines the baseline. If your budget is driven by fear of lacking comfort rather than trust in God's provision, you are not budgeting. You are hoarding. Jesus taught his disciples to pray for daily bread, not annual surplus. Matthew 6:11 records. Contentment begins when you stop equating security with accumulation and start measuring sufficiency by Scripture's standard: food, clothing, and the presence of a God who will never leave. Get out of the debt trap. Proverbs 22:7. Debt does not feel like slavery at first. It feels like opportunity. It feels like access. It feels like the only way to close the gap between what you earn and what you need. But Proverbs 22:7 describes the actual structure. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. This is not metaphor. It is description of a power relationship that shifts the moment you sign the agreement. The Hebrew word for slave in this verse is the same term used throughout the Old Testament to describe forced servitude. The borrower does not merely owe money. The borrower becomes subject to the lender's terms, timeline, and authority. Proverbs 22:7 is positioned between verses about treating the poor harshly and warnings about sowing injustice. The context suggests that lending often becomes a mechanism of exploitation, trapping the vulnerable under obligations they cannot escape. The borrower loses autonomy. Every financial decision must now account for the lender's claim. Romans 13:8 applies this principle directly to Christians. Let no debt remain outstanding, except the continuing debt to love one another. The Greek phrasing means you should not allow debt to linger, to remain perpetually unpaid. Some interpret this as a total prohibition against borrowing. Others read it as a command to honor agreements and repay promptly. Either way, the standard is clear. Debt should not define your financial position. Love is the only obligation meant to last forever. Modern consumer culture normalizes perpetual debt. Car loans roll into new car loans. Credit cards carry balances for years. Student loans stretch across decades. People treat monthly payments as fixed expenses rather than evidence of bondage. But every dollar sent to interest is a dollar that cannot serve, save, or give. Proverbs 22:7 forces the question, who controls your income, you or your creditors? List every debt by balance and interest rate. Pay minimum on all except the smallest. Then attack that one with intensity until it is gone. Repeat until you owe no one anything except love. If debt has you trapped, tell us which type hit hardest in the comments. Plan your giving on purpose too. Corinthians 9:7. Giving without intention produces resentment. You hand over money because someone asked, because guilt pressed, because the moment felt awkward if you refused. Then later you regret it. You wonder if you gave too much, or to the wrong cause, or under manipulation. 2 Corinthians 9:7 addresses this precisely. Each one must give just as he has, decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. The Greek word for decided carries the sense of deliberate choice, of sitting down and forming a judgment before acting. This is not spontaneous emotion. This is planned generosity. The verse explicitly rejects two motives, reluctance and compulsion. Reluctance means you give, but wish you had not. Compulsion means external pressure forced your hand. Both violate the principle. God does not want your money if your heart resents the transfer. He wants purposeful, joyful stewardship. The New Testament church modeled this. 2 Corinthians 8 describes the Macedonian churches giving beyond their ability, but doing so of their own accord. They begged Paul for the privilege of participation. That is not manipulation. That is ownership. Acts 5 records Ananias and Sapphira lying about their gift. Peter's rebuke in verse 4 clarifies the issue. After it was sold, was it not at your disposal? They were not required to give. The sin was pretense, not the amount. Giving must flow from decision, not performance. Modern church culture sometimes creates pressure that contradicts this. Pledges become public. Envelopes get scrutinized. Generosity becomes competition. But 2 Corinthians 9:7 protects both giver and receiver by making intention the measure, not total. Deuteronomy 15:10 warns, "Give generously to them and do so without a grudging heart." If your budget does not include planned, purposeful giving, you are managing money without worship. Decide in advance what percentage or amount you will give each month. Write it into the budget as a non-negotiable line. Let it be cheerful because it was chosen, not coerced. Every step in this list is about one thing, knowing who owns what you think you control. You do not budget to become financially independent. You budget to become a faithful steward under permanent authority. The distinction matters because independence is the lie that ruined Eden. The serpent offered autonomy, Genesis 3:5 records, the promise that you could be like God, knowing good and evil, without submission. That same impulse drives modern financial anxiety. People chase security as if accumulation could replace dependence on the one who gives breath, rain, and harvest. But Luke 12:15 warns that life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. You cannot store enough to exempt yourself from trust. Joseph stored grain, but he did not store it for himself. Proverbs commands you to know your flocks, but flocks are not idols. Paul set the contentment threshold at food and clothing, but he did not forbid planning. Romans 13:8 forbids perpetual debt, but not because debt is the ultimate evil. 2 Corinthians 9:7 requires intentional giving, but intention must be joyful, not mechanical. The unifying principle across all 8 steps is this: God evaluates your fitness for greater responsibility by watching how you manage small amounts now. If you cannot track 1 month's spending, why would he trust you with a household, a ministry, or a legacy? If you cannot delay gratification for 7 years like Joseph, how will you endure 7 days of real testing? The budget is not the point. The budget reveals whether your heart bows to comfort or to stewardship. If you like our content, consider subscribing. Or if some topics did not make this list, or there are topics you want us to feature, please leave them in the comments. What are you managing today that God is using to test your readiness for tomorrow?